Most people think a debt crisis ends when the debt gets paid off. That is not how governments solve debt crises. Governments almost never solve them honestly. They solve them politically. They solve them by changing the rules, changing the incentives, changing the path of money, and most importantly, changing who gets quietly sacrificed so the structure can keep standing. That is the real story here. On May 15, 2026, the chair at the Federal Reserve is expected to change. Most people will not care. They will hear one more name, one more ceremony, one more man in a suit talking about stability, price pressures, labor markets, and the long run. Then they will go back to work, back to bills, back to whatever little system they built to survive the month. That is exactly why this matters. Because the biggest financial changes rarely arrive as a dramatic emergency for the public. They arrive as administrative replacement. A new chair, a new plan, a new vocabulary, a new promise that this time the pain can be made manageable. But there is no painless way out of a debt crisis. That is the first rule. Once a country owes too much to repay, honestly, somebody is going to suffer. Maybe not later, somebody pays. The only real question is who, and if you study history carefully enough, the answer becomes painfully consistent. The saver pays first, the worker with cash savings pays first, the pensioner paid in slow money pays first, the family sitting in the bank collecting small interest, thinking they are being prudent, pays first. The owner of productive assets gets protected first. That is how the game works. And I think the next Federal Reserve chair may be about to play that game again. Now let me slow this down and explain the machine, because once you see the machine, you stop being surprised by the outcomes. The Federal Reserve is called the Federal Reserve, but almost every word in that title misleads ordinary people. It is not a bank you can walk into. It is not a reserve in the common sense people imagine, and it is not a normal arm of government the president can command like a cabinet department. That matters because the public keeps thinking politics works there the same way it works everywhere else. It does not. Presidents can complain, they can pressure, they can threaten rhetorically, but they cannot simply snap their fingers and fire the chair because they feel impatient. That is why Jerome Powell staying in place through all the public noise mattered. And that is why the term expiration matters even more. The seat only truly changes when the term changes. That is when the hand on the wheel changes. And when the hand on the wheel changes during a debt crisis, I pay attention, not because men are magical, because incentives are, the new plan matters, because the context is ugly enough that every policy move now has deep consequences. The United States is carrying more than $39 trillion in debt. Fay file site Fay turn 38 file 0 Fay, that is already obscene. But the bigger problem is not the headline number by itself. The bigger problem is the interest. The fastest growing major expense in the federal system is not some beautiful new project. It is not a moonshot. It is not an industrial revolution. It is debt service. More than $1 trillion a year is now going toward interest. Fay site Fay turn 38 file 0 Fay. That is what debt does in the late stage. It stops serving the state and begins feeding on it. And once that happens, debt is no longer just a fiscal statistic. It becomes a political and monetary trap. The government cannot spend less easily because too many promises now sit inside the budget like landmines. It cannot raise taxes enough without political pain. It cannot refinance comfortably if rates remain elevated. And it cannot simply repay the principal because the gap between what comes in and what goes out is still enormous. The source transcript frames it plainly: roughly $5 trillion in tax revenue against about $7 trillion in spending, with the difference borrowed Fay file site Fay turn 38 file 0 Fay. That is not a temporary imbalance. That is a system built on rollover. This is where most people start fantasizing. They imagine the debt crisis will be solved through discipline, that the government will finally get serious, that Washington will rediscover restraint, stop overspending, and patiently work the debt down. I do not believe that for 1 second. Not because I dislike discipline, because I understand politics. A democracy soaked in promises does not choose pain voluntarily. That leaves the same old escape hatch: financial repression. That is the phrase most people need to understand. Financial repression sounds technical. It sounds like something best left to textbooks and men who enjoy speaking in acronyms. It is not. It is simple. It means making the government richer by making savers poorer. That is the cleanest definition I know. You keep interest rates lower than the inflation rate. You push institutions toward government debt. You let the state borrow below the real cost of money. And over time, the real value of the debt burden shrinks. Not because it was repaid honestly, but because the currency and the purchasing power of savings were quietly sacrificed. That is what happened after World War II, and if you want to understand what might be coming next, you have to understand what happened then. In 1946, the United States had about $271 billion in national debt against roughly $222 billion in GDP, a debt to GDP ratio above 100%. By 1974, the debt had risen to roughly $475 billion. But GDP had grown much faster to about $1.55 trillion, driving that ratio down to around 25%. Fe Felicite Fe turn 38 file 0 Fe. Now amateurs look at that and say, wonderful. The debt crisis was solved. The debt was not solved, it was diluted. The ratio improved because the state held interest rates very low while inflation ran hotter, and because institutions were pushed toward lending to the government at terms that were unattractive. In real terms, Fe Felicite Fe turn 38 file 0 Fe, this is the part people miss. The government did not become virtuous. The saver became the sacrifice. If inflation is 5%, 6%, 7%, even 9%, and you are earning 1%, 2%, maybe 3% on your savings or on state paper, then you are not saving. You are being harvested. That is what financial repression feels like from the ground. Your statement still goes up. Your life goes backwards. The nominal number says you are behaving responsibly. The real world says you are losing. That is the whole trick. Now, if we were entering the same exact setup as the 1940s, I would still be cautious. But this time the structure is worse. That is what should really worry you. Back then, much of the debt got locked in at long maturities. The state borrowed long and cheaply, which meant it had time for repression to work. The source transcript emphasizes that the older structure leaned on 10, 20, and 30-year loans, while today S-debt is much shorter in maturity, more like a giant adjustable rate mortgage. Fe Felicite Fe turn 38 file 0 Fe, that is an enormous difference. It means the federal government is much more sensitive to rates now than people want to admit. When your debt structure resets quickly, the interest burden can explode quickly. That makes lower interest rates even more politically attractive, which is why the new plan matters so much. Here is the broad outline presented in the source material. First, cut rates. Second, shrink the Fed's balance sheet. Third, rely on AI-driven productivity to help hold inflation down while doing the first two. Fe Felicite Fe turn 38 file 0 Fe. Now on the surface, this sounds clever, maybe even elegant. Lower rates reduce the cost of servicing the debt. Shrinking the balance sheet pulls money out and supposedly helps suppress inflationary pressure. And if AI makes businesses more productive and lowers costs, perhaps the economy gets the growth benefit without the same inflationary punishment. That is the sales pitch. I understand why the sales pitch is attractive. The only problem is that debt crises do not care how attractive your pitch sounds. They care about mechanics, and the mechanics here are uncomfortable. Let us start with the first piece, lower rates. The source transcript says Kevin Warsh has argued for cutting rates by a full percentage point in 2026, which would take policy rates from around 3.75% toward 2.75%. Fe Felicite Fe turn 38 file 0 Fe inflation stays around 3%. Then you immediately enter the same dangerous zone that made financial repression work in the past. Rates below inflation, that is the key, that is the doorway. And once you cross that doorway, the message to savers is brutally clear. Your money is no longer being protected. It is being slowly confiscated in real terms. This is why I always laugh when people tell me lower rates are good news for everyone. Lower rates are good news for debtors first. They are especially good news for the largest debtor in the system, which is the state itself. if you owe $39 trillion and your debt resets quickly. Lower rates are not just convenient, they are survival. That is why the saver is always the easiest person to sacrifice. The saver is diffuse, the saver is polite. The saver does not organize like a lobbying bloc. The saver gets paid in statements, not in sudden pain. That is what makes financial repression politically useful. It hurts in slow motion. Now, let us go to the second piece, shrinking the balance sheet. This is where the plan sounds cleaner than it is. The Fed created money to buy treasuries and other assets. Those holdings sit on its balance sheet. Selling or letting those assets roll off means, in theory, pulling money out of the system. Fay Filicite, Fay Turn 38 File 0 Fay. So the story becomes lower rates on one side, balance sheet, runoff on the other, and the two offset each other. That is the theory. But theory has a nasty habit of becoming unstable when it collides with supply and demand. If the Fed is no longer the huge buyer sitting underneath the Treasury market, then someone else must absorb that debt. And if someone else must absorb it, then either private demand is strong enough to do so at acceptable yields, or yields rise until demand appears. That is the mechanical truth. Treasuries are not exempt from supply and demand just because the system desperately wants them to be. The transcript itself recognizes this tension. If the Fed goes from buyer to seller, interest rates would normally want to rise, not fall, unless private demand steps in strongly enough. Fay Filicite, Fay Turn 38 File 0 Fay, and that is where I become skeptical. What if private demand is not sufficient at the price policymakers want? What if foreign buyers are less eager? What if domestic institutions hesitate? What if the market says, we will lend, but not that cheaply? That is the old conflict again. The state wants lower rates. The market wants compensation. Historically, when that conflict becomes too sharp, governments do not shrug and accept defeat. They change rules. That is the next thing people need to keep in mind. The original financial repression after the war did not work, only because rates were low. It worked because institutions were effectively guided, pressured, or regulated into holding government debt. The transcript explains that banks, pension funds, and institutions were made to lend to the government at unattractive real rates through a more coercive legal and regulatory structure. Fay Filicite, Fay Turn 38 File 0 Fay, that matters immensely. Because if voluntary demand is insufficient, history tells you what comes next. Not necessarily the exact same law, not the same acronym, not the same statutory language, but the same instinct. The state begins reshaping the environment so that domestic savings and institutional capital have fewer attractive alternatives to state paper. That is what all prudent investors should be watching. Now, not merely rate cuts, not merely speeches, watch the rules. Watch pension guidance, watch bank capital rules, watch any policy, regulation, or incentive that subtly channels savings toward government funding, because once that starts, you are no longer just in a normal rate cycle. You are in the architecture of repression. Now, let us talk about the third piece of the plan, AI as disinflation. I understand the argument. It is not nonsense. If AI truly raises productivity, lowers costs, reduces labor intensity in certain functions, improves logistics, improves enterprise efficiency, and generally allows more output per unit of input, then yes, it can be a disinflationary force that is real. But real is not the same as sufficient. That is the entire issue. Productivity gains can help at the margin. They do not automatically erase a debt crisis. They do not automatically offset deficits. They do not automatically make lower rates below inflation harmless. And they certainly do not erase the distributional reality that if rates are repressed and savers are paid less than inflation, the saver still loses even in a more productive economy. That is what the techno-optimists always forget. Higher productivity does not rescue the person who sat in cash at 2.75% while the cost of life kept rising faster. The saver still gets harvested, the asset owner still gets the lift. That is why I always say technological optimism can be true and still not save you from monetary dilution. Those are different layers of reality. And the layer I care most about here is the human consequence. Who wins? Who loses? The source material gives the answer away near the end. Savers lose, asset holders win. Faithfully cite Fay Turn 38, File 0 Fay. That is not subtle. That is the whole strategy in plain sight. If you earn below inflation on your cash, CDs, or low-yield conservative savings, you lose purchasing power. If you own assets that reprice with inflation or benefit from easier money over time, you have a chance to outrun the loss. That is why inflation tends to make the rich richer and the ordinary saver poorer. As the transcript bluntly argues, Fay file a cite Fay Turn 38 File 0. Fay now, do not misunderstand me. This does not mean markets only go up in straight lines. The source transcript itself notes that there were recessions and market crashes during the earlier Repression period, even though long-run asset prices rose. Fay cite Fay Turn 38 File 0 Fay that matters. Because one of the dumbest reactions to a macro thesis is to treat it like permission to buy anything at any price and call yourself prepared. Number good structure does not eliminate volatility. It changes who wins over long stretches. That is why my conclusion is not go all in on risk. My conclusion is more sober. If the state moves into a new phase of repression, cash hoarding and passive saving become more dangerous than the public realizes. The person with all his safety and paper instruments paying less than inflation is the obvious loser. The person with some ownership of productive assets, scarce assets, or inflation. Resistant claims stands a better chance. That is the asymmetry. And if I were rebuilding or defending wealth right now, I would organize my thinking around that asymmetry. Not around party politics, not around which chairman sounds kinder on television, not around whether one man is better than another. This is bigger than personality. This is about arithmetic. Debt too large to honor, honestly, a political class unwilling to accept enough pain to clear it, a central bank leadership transition at exactly the point where lower rates become attractive, a short duration debt structure that makes those lower rates immediately valuable to the debtor state. A historical precedent showing that the state can improve its burden by impoverishing savers in real terms, and a fresh narrative AI productivity being used as the hopeful lubricant that makes the whole thing sound more benign than it really is. That is the real structure. And once you see the structure, you stop asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, will the government erase the debt? Number, the debt will not be erased. Honestly, the right question is, who will absorb the cost of making the debt more manageable? That is the adult question history. S answer is clear. Savers. The cash. Heavy. The yield. Blind. The people who think prudence means holding nominal claims while the denominator itself is being weakened. That is who gets hit. So if you ask me what I think is really coming, I would say this. I think the most likely outcome is not some neat policy triumph. It is a new phase where rates move lower, real returns on safe money turn uglier, the state gets breathing room, and the public slowly realizes that saving in the old way no longer preserves the future. That is repression. It always sounds technical at the beginning. Then later, it feels personal. It feels like groceries rising faster than your safe yield. It feels like homes and equities and hard assets staying expensive while your savings account insists you should be grateful for 2% or 3%. It feels like the people who own things pull further away from the people who stored things. That is the social reality of the policy. It makes debt more manageable by making savers less powerful. That is the exchange. I do not like it, but I do not need to like it to recognize it. And if you recognize it early enough, you do not have to be one of the people quietly funding it. That is why I keep coming back to one practical principle. You cannot afford to have all of your future sitting in cash like instruments if the state is entering a new repression cycle. You need ownership, you need productive assets, you need some exposure to things that can reprice if the unit itself is being politically degraded. Not because every asset class rises every day, because over long stretches, repression is built to rescue debtors and asset owners before it rescues savers. That is the hierarchy. That is the whole model. If May 15th really becomes the beginning of a new policy direction, I do not think the public will hear about it in the right language. They will not say, "We are about to make savers poorer so the state can survive more comfortably." Of course not. They will talk about growth, about modernization, about efficiency, about balancing inflation risks with debt sustainability, about a productivity revolution, about lower rates helping business, helping households, helping America compete. Some of that language will even contain real fragments of truth. That is what makes these cycles so effective. The policy does not need to be wholly false. It only needs to hide the main transfer. And the main transfer is simple. The state gets relief, the saver gets diluted, the owner gets protected first. That is the pattern. That is what happened before. And that is what I think financially literate people should be preparing for. Now, not panic preparation, not cynicism, clarity, not political theater, balance, sheet reality. So if I had to reduce this entire issue to one brutal sentence, it would be this: America does not get out of a $39 trillion debt trap by becoming disciplined. It gets out of it, if at all, by making honest saving less rewarding, forcing more capital toward state funding, and letting inflation plus lower rates do what explicit default is too politically ugly to do. That is the plan beneath the language. That is the arithmetic beneath the ceremony. And if you understand that now, you have time to behave differently before the people around you start feeling the change only after it is already eaten into their wallet.